When 32-year-old Daniel Dan Mercer and his 29-year-old wife Sophie left their small inland hometown for their honeymoon, it was meant to be the perfect start to the rest of their lives. They'd been married less than a week. Friends described them as inseparable, a couple who didn't just love each other, but seemed to enjoy every mundane moment together. The honeymoon destination was a mid-range but charming coastal resort, about a 5-hour drive away. For Sophie, who'd grown up hundreds of miles from the ocean, it was supposed to be her first time seeing the beach. The day they left was cool and overcast, the kind of weather that could break either toward warm sunshine or heavy rain. They loaded their suitcases into the trunk of Dan's dark blue sedan. The most distinctive was a large hard-shell suitcase, pale cream in color with a rigid handle and travel stickers from previous family trips. A piece of luggage Dan had borrowed from his father. Sophie tucked in a few personal things: a paperback novel, her makeup bag, and a small leather-bound travel journal she planned to write in daily. Before closing the lid, she carefully slid in a framed copy of one of their wedding photos, just in case we don't get another chance to print more before we go home. Dan laughed at her sentimentality, but helped arrange it so the glass wouldn't crack. Their first planned stop was a roadside diner about halfway to the coast. According to the waitress who served them, the couple lingered longer than most travelers, eating slowly, chatting, and sharing a slice of pie. They seemed relaxed, in no hurry at all, she later told investigators. When they left, it was just after 3:30 p.m., and they headed south toward a scenic coastal highway known for its ocean views and winding cliffs. That was the last confirmed sighting of the Mercers. When they failed to arrive at the resort that evening, the staff assumed they'd simply been delayed. But when no one had heard from them by the following afternoon, no calls, no check-in, nothing, Sophie's sister began to worry. Calls to their cell phone numbers went straight to voicemail. 2 days later, the family reported them missing. Investigators quickly realized the trail was alarmingly short. There was no traffic camera footage beyond the diner. The route they were believed to have taken had large stretches without surveillance, and few people lived along those cliffside miles. Searches began immediately, both on land and along the rocky coastline. Volunteer teams walked the entire stretch of road where they might have traveled, peering over guardrails into steep ravines and scanning beaches for any sign of debris. The Coast Guard joined in, sweeping the ocean near the base of the cliffs with searchlights and sonar. Still nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a piece of the car, not even a single tire mark out of place. It was as if they had simply driven off the map. The lack of evidence frustrated investigators. In most missing person cases involving vehicles, there's something: skid marks, broken guardrails, fluid stains, or personal items thrown from a crash. Here, there was nothing at all. It's like they were picked up by the sky, one searcher later said. Rumors began to swirl in the small coastal towns nearby. Some claimed they'd seen a dark sedan pulled over near an abandoned service station along the route. Others whispered about old smuggling trails that wound from the cliffs down to hidden inlets, long abandoned but still known to certain locals. None of these leads could be confirmed. Back in their hometown, the Mercers' disappearance dominated local news for weeks. Friends organized fundraisers to keep the search going. Sophie's parents taped her wedding photo to their front door, framed by flowers and handwritten notes from neighbors. Dan's younger brother, visibly worn from sleepless nights, told reporters, "They were so happy, there's no reason they would have just left." By the third week, official search efforts were scaled back. There were no new leads, no sightings, and no signs of either the car or the couple. For their families, it was an unbearable kind of loss, not just grief, but the sharp-edged frustration of not knowing. Months would pass before the first real break in the case appeared, but when it did, it wouldn't come from a detective or a tip or a witness. It would come from a fisherman, miles offshore, who was about to pull something heavy and unexpected from the deep. The weeks after Daniel and Sophie Mercer vanished were marked by frustration and unanswered questions. Law enforcement, having exhausted their immediate resources, began shifting the case into what they called periodic review status. To the families, it felt like abandonment. "They're not a file in a cabinet," Sophie's father told a local paper. "They're out there somewhere. We just don't know where." The coastal highway where the couple was last believed to have driven was unforgiving. Narrow lanes carved into cliff faces, with no guardrails in certain stretches. Investigators rechecked every sharp turn and blind curve, looking for even the faintest hint of disturbed soil or bent vegetation that might indicate a car had gone over. They found nothing. By the second month, the volunteers who had been combing the roadside began to dwindle. The ocean, with its changing tides and unpredictable currents, had swallowed plenty of secrets over the years, but this case had an edge that unsettled even the locals: the total absence of debris. If a car had gone in, even in deep water, something should have surfaced within days, but the ocean had given nothing back. In the small fishing communities along the coast, the disappearance became a quiet undercurrent of conversation. At dockside cafes, fishermen speculated between themselves. One, an older man named Graham Ellison, remembered a stretch of deep water about 2 miles offshore where nets often snagged on something heavy. "Could be old wreckage," he told a friend over coffee. "Or could be something newer. Currents dump all kinds of things there." It was in late September, nearly 3 months after the Mercers vanished, that Graham headed out before sunrise, piloting his modest trawler into calm but dark waters. He was alone that morning, something he preferred when fishing for his own stock rather than the cooperative's orders. The horizon was just starting to pale when he felt the drag on his net. At first, Graham assumed it was a stubborn tangle of kelp or a sunken log. But as he hauled the net toward the surface, the weight shifted oddly, thudding against the hull with a muted, solid sound. He frowned, leaning over to catch the first glimpse of what he'd hooked. The object broke the surface slowly, dripping seawater, strands of kelp sliding away. It was pale, rectangular, and too rigid to be a bundle of nets or gear. Barnacles clustered over its edges, and patches of faded color hinted at something man-made beneath the crust of marine growth. By the time Graham had wrestled it onto the deck, he could see what it was: a large, hard-shell suitcase, the kind made decades earlier with thick molded sides and heavy metal latches. The handle was cracked, one corner dented inward. Across one face, nearly obscured by grime and barnacles, was the ghost of an old travel sticker. Graham crouched, squinting, and made out a few blurred letters, enough to recognize the name of the coastal resort where the Mercers had been headed. He stood there for a long moment, seawater pooling at his boots, the rhythmic sway of the boat suddenly feeling heavier. In his 20 years fishing those waters, he had never pulled up something like this. By habit, Graham considered keeping it. Old suitcases sometimes contained valuables if they'd been lost from passing ships. But the connection to the missing couple was too sharp to ignore. He reached for the marine radio and called the harbor master, his voice steady but low. "You'll want to get the police down here," he said. "I think I've got something of theirs." When the authorities arrived, the suitcase was still sitting on the deck, dripping steadily. Officers and evidence technicians crowded the narrow space, photographing it from every angle before carefully lifting it into a waiting van. For the first time in months, the investigation had something tangible, something that had clearly belonged to Daniel and Sophie Mercer. But no one yet knew if what was inside would answer the questions that had haunted their families, or raise even darker ones. The suitcase arrived at the county evidence facility mid-morning, still wet from the sea. Officers handled it like something fragile, setting it on a plastic-covered table in the forensic bay. Salt water dripped steadily from the seams, pooling beneath it. The smell, briny, sour, tinged with the faint odor of decay, quickly filled the room. Detective Maria Alvarez, who had been on the Mercer case from the beginning, stood nearby with her arms folded. She'd walked this investigation through weeks of dead ends, watched families grow desperate, and fought budget cuts that had nearly buried it as a cold file. Now she stared at the battered, pale shell of the suitcase as if it were a living witness. "Don't force it," she told the techs as they studied the corroded latches. The hinges were badly rusted, eaten through in places. Barnacles clung stubbornly to the edges, and the faint remnants of the resort sticker were visible beneath a layer of grime. It was unmistakable now. This suitcase had been meant for the Mercers' honeymoon. The team began by documenting every surface. Photographs captured close-ups of the damage: the dented corner, the cracked handle, and the peculiar abrasion marks along one side, as if it had scraped repeatedly against something hard underwater. Once the exterior was logged, the techs set up a drying chamber. It took hours for the salt water to evaporate enough for them to attempt opening it without destroying the contents. The metal latches resisted at first, then gave way with a brittle snap. A thin mist of salt and dust puffed into the air. The first thing visible inside was fabric, heavy, water-darkened, clinging to itself in damp folds. The smell intensified. Gloves on, the Tex lifted the top layer. A woman's dress, once a light pastel but now bleached almost gray by months in seawater. The seams had frayed, one strap torn completely away, as if by force. Detective Alvarez felt her stomach tighten. Beneath it lay a smaller object wrapped in plastic. Carefully they peeled it open to reveal a framed photograph. Daniel and Sophie on their wedding day, smiling into the sun. The glass was cracked, moisture trapped inside, creating a cloudy haze, yet their faces were clear enough to recognize instantly. Alvarez set it gently aside, aware of the emotional weight it would carry for the families. Next came something unexpected, a leather-bound travel journal, its cover warped and darkened. Most of the pages inside had fused together from water damage, but a few toward the back had separated enough to read faint lines of ink. The handwriting was Sophie's, neat, looping letters. One entry described their drive, the changing light along the cliffs, and how she thought they'd been followed since leaving the diner. The last legible line read, "That car is still behind us. Dan says I'm imagining it, but I'm sure it slowed when we did." The final item was smaller but perhaps most conclusive. A set of car keys attached to a faded leather keychain embossed with the resort's logo. The metal was pitted with corrosion, but the shape of the keys matched the make and model of Dan's blue sedan. Alvarez stepped back, looking at the collection on the table, the torn dress, the damaged photograph, the journal with its unsettling hint of pursuit, and the keys that proved the Mercers had at least made it most of the way to their destination. The discovery was a breakthrough, but also a trap. These objects told pieces of a story, yet none revealed the ending. The suitcase had been in the water for months, drifting, who knew how far. The couple could have crashed, been forced off the road, or met with something far worse before the suitcase ever touched the sea. For Alvarez, the journal entry was the anchor. She'd seen too many cases where a shadow vehicle in the hours before a disappearance was no coincidence. She made a note to have traffic reports and incident logs from that day re-pulled, focusing on the stretch between the diner and the coast. Meanwhile, the suitcase and its contents were sealed in new evidence bags. They would be examined for trace material, fibers, fingerprints, anything that had survived months in salt water. News of the find leaked before the day was over. That evening, both families received calls from the department, followed by the kind of grim, careful visits detectives made when they had more questions than answers. Sophie's mother wept when she saw the photograph. Dan's brother asked one question over and over. If the suitcase made it out there, why not the car? It was a question Alvarez couldn't answer. Not yet. But she had the first solid lead in months, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. Detective Maria Alvarez had been over the coastal route dozens of times in the first weeks of the investigation, but this return trip felt different. Now she had a physical connection to the Mercers, their suitcase, and inside it, Sophie's unsettling journal entry about being followed. That detail changed the entire framework of the case. The drive from the diner to the coast took Alvarez just under 2 hours in late morning traffic. She kept her eyes moving constantly. The sharp drop-offs, the blind curves, the stretches with no shoulder where a vehicle could disappear from sight in seconds. The air carried the tang of salt and the constant low roar of waves below. She pulled off at a turnout overlooking a particularly steep cliff where the guardrail ended abruptly, not because of damage, but simply because none had been installed in the early 80s. Looking down, the rocky shore was partially visible, waves surging white against jagged stone. If a car had gone over here, it would have been visible from above, but months of searches had never turned up so much as a fender. Alvarez's next stop was an abandoned service station a few miles inland, a place that had been mentioned in an early tip. The building sagged under the weight of decades without upkeep, paint blistered, windows boarded, weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. A lone gull perched on the rusted sign frame, screeching as she stepped out of her car. Inside, the air was musty with the scent of old oil and salt carried inland by the wind. Alvarez moved her flashlight slowly across the floor, catching scuff marks that seemed fresher than the rest of the decay. She crouched, studying the faint impressions. They weren't tire tracks, more like the marks of something heavy being dragged. The dust coating them wasn't decades old. A man's voice from the doorway startled her. "That place still gives me the creeps." She turned to see a fisherman in his 60s, holding a tackle box, clearly on his way back from shore. "I used to gas up here," he continued. "Back in the summer of '87, saw a dark blue sedan sitting right out front one night. Young couple inside, looked like they were arguing." Alvarez's pulse ticked upward. "You? Sure about the year?" "Positive," the man said. "My kid was born that summer. I remember because the station had already closed, so I wondered why they'd stop here. Didn't think much of it till I heard about the missing Newlyweds later." He shrugged, adjusting his cap. "Next morning the car was gone, but there were fresh marks down by the side path. Leads toward the bluff." Alvarez asked him to show her, and together they walked to a narrow trail hidden behind overgrown brush. It wound toward the coastline, ending at a flat stretch of cliff barely wide enough for two people to stand side by side. There was no railing, no warning sign. The drop was sheer. The fisherman hesitated, looking out at the ocean. "Lot of stories about this spot. Smugglers, accidents, even a few who say folks were pushed. I don't come here much." Back at her car, Alvarez jotted everything in her notebook. The location fit. It was between the diner and the resort, and it was remote enough that any encounter there would have gone unseen. She took photographs, GPS coordinates, and a soil sample from the edge. Her final stop of the day was the small harbor where Graham Ellison, the fisherman who'd found the suitcase, kept his trawler. He was mending nets when she arrived, the late afternoon sun turning the water gold. "Detective," he greeted, setting his work aside. "Any news from the suitcase?" "Some," she replied. "Enough to know the Mercers likely made it close to the coast. I need to understand exactly where you found it." Graham led her aboard his boat, pointing to a laminated nautical chart. He tapped a spot about 2 miles offshore. "Right here. Deep water, strong current. If something falls in around the southern cliffs, the tide can carry it straight here. It's like a funnel." Alvarez traced the line from the bluff where the old service station path ended, out to the marked location. The distance wasn't far, close enough that if the Mercer's car had gone in near that spot, any loose objects could have drifted to where Graham's net caught them. She left the harbor with the beginnings of a new theory, but also a new problem. If the suitcase had traveled that route, the car, and possibly the bodies, should be somewhere along the same underwater path. Yet no search had ever found them. That night, Alvarez sat in her office, the map spread across her desk. The clues were stacking in strange ways. A remote bluff, an abandoned service station, Sophie's written fear of being followed, and now the fisherman's memory of seeing them arguing. It felt less and less like a tragic accident and more like a staged disappearance, or a confrontation that had turned deadly. The ocean might have hidden the truth for months, but Alvarez wasn't done asking questions. And she had a feeling the sea hadn't given up its last piece of the Mercer mystery. The following week, Detective Maria Alvarez stood on the deck of a rented search vessel, the salt wind cutting sharp against her cheeks. Below her, the dark green water shifted with the lazy rise and fall of the tide, deceptively calm on the surface. She had convinced the department to authorize a limited dive operation in the area where Graham Ellison's net had snagged the Mercer's suitcase. Funding was tight, and the brass wasn't eager to pour more hours into a 3-month-old disappearance, but Alvarez had learned to fight her cases tooth and nail, and she wasn't going to let this one slip under. The dive team consisted of 2 veteran rescue divers, Carter and Vance, who were accustomed to pulling more than just wreckage from the coastal depths. They checked and rechecked their gear as the boat idled over the coordinates Graham had given her. "Currents are strong here," Carter said, pulling his mask into place. "If something's down there, it's either wedged in place or it's long gone." "Or it's hidden," Alvarez replied. With a nod, the divers rolled backward into the sea, bubbles trailing up in silver bursts. Alvarez watched their progress on the monitor linked to their helmet cams, the murky water swallowing them after just a few feet. The descent was slow. Visibility worsened as they neared the bottom. a swirling haze of silt and plant matter stirred by the tide. The faint outline of the ocean floor emerged, rock outcroppings, scattered kelp, and the occasional ghostly shape of fish drifting past. 10 minutes into the sweep, Vance's voice crackled through the comms. "Contact. Looks like metal. Large." Alvarez leaned closer to the screen. The camera swung toward a shape partially buried in sediment, curved, dark, and unmistakably part of a car's frame. "Can you confirm the make?" she asked. Carter swam closer, running a gloved hand along the fender. "Corrosion's heavy, but yeah, matches the sedan you showed us. Same grille style, early 80s model." The divers worked carefully, clearing silt away from the vehicle. Its windows were shattered, the driver's side door twisted inward as if from an impact. A length of torn fabric fluttered in the current near the back seat. Alvarez thought immediately of the torn strap on Sophie's dress. Then Vance's voice sharpened. Maria, you're going to want to see this." The camera tilted toward the trunk. Wedged halfway under a rock shelf, the lid was bent open just enough to reveal what was inside. A second, smaller suitcase, its surface coated in marine growth. "Secure it," Alvarez ordered. The divers worked in slow, methodical movements, prying the case free without breaking it apart. As they did, the current shifted, pulling the silt aside and exposing something else that made Alvarez's throat tighten. A pale, skeletal shape lay against the rock shelf just beyond the trunk, ribs half buried, a length of algae-draped fabric tangled around the remains. The skull was missing, carried off perhaps by the sea, but the posture, curled inward, arms still bent across where the chest had been, was unmistakable. The comms went quiet for a moment, only the soft hiss of air through the diver's regulators filling the feed. "Human remains," Carter confirmed. "Size and frame? Likely female." Alvarez closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. If the condition of the remains matched the timeline, this could be Sophie Mercer, but there was no sign of Daniel, and no immediate sign of how or why they had ended up here. The smaller suitcase was brought up first, hoisted carefully onto the deck of the vessel. It was even more battered than the first, one hinge gone, corners caved in from pressure or impact. Alvarez had it placed immediately in a secure container. The divers marked the exact coordinates of the skeletal remains for a recovery dive later that day. As they headed back to shore, Alvarez stood at the stern, watching the trail of churned water fade behind them. She could already feel the case shifting in her mind. This was no longer just a disappearance. This was a confirmed death, and potentially a homicide. Back on land, the forensic team swarmed the second suitcase. Alvarez stayed close, knowing all too well that whatever was inside could shape the rest of the investigation. The latch gave way more easily than the first case. Inside, among layers of seawater-stiffened clothing, they found a man's leather wallet. The ID inside confirmed it. Daniel Mercer. Alongside it was a sealed envelope, edges swollen from water but still intact enough to hold its contents. When they carefully slid the letter free, the ink had blurred in places, but one line remained dark and legible. "If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. We're not safe." Alvarez stared at the words, feeling the weight of them. Sophie had written about being followed. Now Daniel, in his last known possession, had left a written warning. This wasn't an accident. Someone had hunted them, and at least one of them might still be missing. The skeletal remains were transferred to the county coroner's office under a police escort, sealed in a white evidence shroud. Detective Maria Alvarez followed in her unmarked car, the weight of the discovery pressing against her temples. For months she'd been chasing fragments. Now she had a body, or at least most of one. Dr. Ellen Rhodes, the county's chief forensic anthropologist, met her in the lab. A tall woman with precise movements and an unshakable demeanor, Rhodes had worked on some of the region's most complex cases. She gestured toward the stainless steel table where the remains lay. "Female," Rhodes began, her voice clinical. "Estimated height, 5'5" to 5'6". Bone density consistent with someone in her 20s. No skull, but dentition and remaining skeletal features line up with dental records for Sophie Mercer." Alvarez nodded slowly. "Cause of death?" "That's harder," Rhodes admitted. "Saltwater exposure for this long erases a lot, but..." She pointed to the rib cage. Several ribs showed sharp, clean breaks that weren't consistent with long-term underwater damage. These were caused by significant blunt force trauma, likely before she entered the water. Alvarez studied the fractures, her mind replaying Sophie's last journal entry about the car behind them, the service station sighting, and now this. It was adding up to an ambush, not an accident. "What about the fabric?" she asked. Rhodes held up the algae-draped scrap, found tangled with the bones. "Matches the torn strap from the dress in the first suitcase. Same weave, same fading pattern. This confirms she was wearing it when she died." By mid-afternoon, Alvarez had the preliminary report in hand. Officially, the death was classified as homicide, blunt force trauma to the torso, manner undetermined. Back at the precinct, she spread the case evidence across the conference table. 2 suitcases, the torn dress, the wedding photo, Sophie's journal, Daniel's wallet and letter, and now the forensic report. The absence of Daniel's remains loomed larger than ever. She started reviewing every witness statement again, highlighting inconsistencies. One stood out, a report from the early days that had been dismissed as unreliable. A delivery truck driver claimed to have seen 2 vehicles parked nose-to-nose near the old service station on the night the Mercers vanished. One was a dark sedan matching the Mercers' car. The other, he thought, was a pale utility van with no markings. At the time, no one had been able to trace the van, but now, with the knowledge of a possible abduction site, Alvarez felt the detail needed revisiting. She pulled the archived vehicle registration lists for that year, focusing on white or pale utility vans owned in the county. One name jumped out, a defunct coastal freight company, shuttered in the late 90s after multiple safety violations. Their last registered address was less than 5 miles from the bluff. Alvarez cross-referenced employee records from the era and found 3 drivers who had criminal records for assault or theft. By early evening, she had narrowed her attention to one, Raymond Coulter, a man with a documented history of violent altercations and a prior arrest for illegal dumping off the same coastal highway. He'd been released just months before the Mercers vanished. She dug deeper. Old employment logs showed Coulter had access to a private dock at the freight company's warehouse, a location that, according to nautical charts, connected to the same current path where Graham's net had pulled up the first suitcase. Her phone buzzed. It was Rhodes again. "Maria, we just finished cleaning the keyring from Daniel's wallet. There's something you should see." Alvarez was back in the lab within half an hour. Rhodes handed her a sealed evidence bag. Inside was the corroded resort keychain. She pointed to the underside of the leather fob where the salt had eaten away a layer of dye, revealing faint but deliberate scratches. "Their initials," Rhodes said. "Not Daniel's or Sophie's. Looks like RC." Alvarez's mind locked onto the coincidence. Raymond Coulter. Whether those scratches were ownership, a signature, or a message, she didn't yet know. But it was the first time a physical piece of evidence had tied an actual name to the Mercers' belongings. That night, Alvarez drove out to the abandoned freight company warehouse. The building loomed at the edge of the harbor, windows boarded, roof sagging. The chain-link gate hung open, the padlock long gone. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old diesel and salt rot. She moved her flashlight across stacks of discarded crates, rusted winches, and the skeletal frame of a forklift. Then she saw it. A weathered, cylindrical supply drum tucked behind a collapsed shelving unit. The metal was dented, and one side bore deep scrape marks that looked eerily similar to the ones on the Mercer's suitcase. She didn't touch it. Instead, she marked the location and called for an evidence team. If this drum had been used to conceal or transport items, or bodies, it could hold the missing link between Coulter, the bluff, and the suitcases. As she stepped back outside, the ocean wind hit her full in the face, carrying with it the low, steady sound of waves. Somewhere out there, in the depths and shadows, were the last pieces of Daniel Mercer's fate, and Alvarez wasn't leaving until she found them. The supply drum was hauled from the warehouse the next morning, its dented metal echoing hollowly as it was set down in the evidence bay. Salt crust clung to the seams, and the interior rattled faintly when moved. Detective Maria Alvarez stood beside the forensics team watching every step. Technician Linda Cho began by photographing the drum from every angle, noting the scrape patterns and corrosion. "This metal's been in contact with seawater before," Cho said, running a gloved hand along the inside lip. "Not for years, though. Looks like it was submerged for a short period and then stored dry." When they pried the lid fully open, the stale scent of brine and rust escaped. Inside were remnants of heavy-duty plastic sheeting, brittle from age, and a tangle of frayed rope. Alvarez's pulse quickened. The rope's fibers matched the faint impression she'd seen on the torn strap of Sophie's dress. In the bottom of the drum lay a more disturbing find, a single men's loafer, water-warped and discolored. The sole was partly detached, but the stitching was intact enough for the brand stamp to be visible. Alvarez recognized it instantly from old photos of Daniel Mercer, the same make and style he'd worn on the wedding trip. Cho sealed the shoe in an evidence bag, while another tech swept the drum's interior for trace material. They recovered a thin layer of sediment identical to samples from the Bluffs shoreline, strengthening the link between the warehouse, the coastline, and the location where the suitcases had surfaced. By mid-afternoon, Alvarez had enough to push for a formal interview with Raymond Coulter. She found him in a small apartment above a bait shop in the harbor district, his heavy frame filling the doorway when he answered. His hair had gone gray, but his eyes held the same wary, assessing glint she'd seen in his mugshot from decades earlier. "I'm not interested in talking to cops," he said, moving to shut the door. Alvarez wedged her foot in the frame. "That's fine. I can have this conversation at the station, or here. Your choice." Coulter's eyes flicked past her to the unmarked car at the curb, then back. After a pause, he stepped aside. The inside of his apartment smelled faintly of fish and stale beer. Alvarez remained standing as Coulter lowered himself into a sagging chair. "You worked for North Shore Freight in '87, she began, "had access to the private dock. So did a lot of people. But not all of them had their initai. All scratched into a keychain found in a missing couple's suitcase." She set the sealed evidence bag on the table. The leather fob inside was unmistakable. Coulter's gaze lingered on it, but his expression didn't change. "I don't know what that is." Alvarez didn't blink. "We also found a supply drum at your old workplace. Rope inside matches fibers from the woman's clothing, and there's a man's shoe in there, same make and style the husband wore." Coulter shifted in his chair. 35 years ago, you think I'm supposed to remember every damn thing that passed through that place?" "You remember this," Alvarez said flatly, "because you don't dump a newlywed couple into the ocean and forget it." For the first time his eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but calculation. "You've got no bodies." "We have one," Alvarez said, letting the weight of the word sink in. "And we'll find the other." The silence stretched. Outside, a gull cried, the sound thin and distant through the open window. Coulter finally leaned back, his expression settling into something cold. "You're fishing, detective." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Maybe. But here's the thing about fishing. Sometimes you haul up exactly what you were looking for, and sometimes you pull up something worse." When she left the apartment, she knew she hadn't gotten a confession. But she'd gotten something else. The flicker in his eyes when she mentioned the bluff, the shoe, the rope. It was the look of a man calculating how much she really knew. Back at the precinct, the lab called with one more development. They'd tested the rope from the drum for microscopic traces and found dried particles of a petroleum-based sealant, the same type used to waterproof the cargo holds of North Shore freight vessels in the '80s. It was enough to tighten the net. Alvarez requested a warrant to search Coulter's personal storage unit, a place he'd been renting, uninterrupted, for over 30 years. The warrant was approved the next morning. Alvarez stood outside the corrugated metal door as an officer. Cut the padlock. The unit smelled of old oil and mildew. Inside were crates of rusted tools, yellowing logbooks from the freight company, and against the back wall, another supply drum. This one was sealed tight. Alvarez didn't open it there. Instead, she marked it for immediate transport to the lab, her gut tightening with the sense that whatever was inside would be the last missing piece. The final drum sat in the evidence bay under bright overhead lights, its dented surface sweating faintly in the warmth of the room. Detective Maria Alvarez stood with her arms folded, watching the forensic team circle it like cautious divers around a shipwreck. It had taken 2 days of legal wrangling to get here. 2 days where Raymond Coulter had gone quiet, his phone off, his apartment dark. Alvarez suspected he knew exactly what was about to happen. Technician Linda Cho, now well acquainted with these drums, knelt to photograph every seam. "Sealant's intact," she said. "If this has been closed for decades, we'll get a preserved interior environment." A metal cutter bit into the rusted lid, the sound a harsh scream against the otherwise still air. When the final edge gave way, Cho and her assistant carefully lifted the top free. The smell hit first, a thick, stagnant mix of seawater rot and old oil. Inside, wrapped in layers of the same heavy-duty plastic from the first drum, was a human form curled into a fetal position. Alvarez felt the muscles in her back go tight. The plastic was cut away with surgical precision, revealing the skeletal remains of a male in dark, degraded clothing. Around the wrist, still hanging loose despite the decades, was a metal watch band, its face clouded but its engraving clear. "To Dan, for every hour of our life together. Love, Sophie." No one in the room spoke for several seconds. It was Daniel Mercer. The missing half of the couple had finally surfaced. Dr. Ellen Rhodes, called in to confirm, leaned over the remains. "Bone structure matches dental and medical records. Cause of death," she paused, pointing to a deep fracture in the side of the skull. "Massive blunt force trauma, likely instant." Alvarez absorbed the words. Sophie had been struck in the torso, Daniel in the head. Both injuries were deliberate. Beneath the body lay one more object, a small, rust-stained leather-bound logbook. Cho slid it into an evidence bag before the damp pages could crumble. When Alvarez opened it later in her office, she found faded handwritten entries, names, dates, cargo descriptions, and scrawled between 2 shipments from 1987 was a chilling line in different handwriting than the rest. "Delivery complete, no witnesses." There was no signature, but Alvarez didn't need one. The freight company's logs, the rope, the sealant, the initials on the keychain, all roads led to Coulter. An arrest warrant went through by sundown. Alvarez in 2 uniforms found him at a harbor bar, nursing a drink. He didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. In interrogation, faced with the logbook, the forensic matches, and the recovered remains, Coulter finally spoke. His voice was flat, as if recounting a job from long ago that had lost all personal meaning. "They were in the wrong place," he said. "Saw something they weren't supposed to see. Orders came down to make sure they didn't talk." Alvarez pressed for details, but he shut down after that. Whether it was smuggling, contraband, or something darker, she might never know. But the Mercers families, what little remained of them, would have answers, and that was more than they'd had in 35 years. A month later, on a gray morning, Alvarez attended a quiet memorial at the bluff. Graham Ellison, the fisherman whose net had started it all, was there, his cap in his hands. Sophie's surviving cousin placed 2 small bouquets at the edge of the water. Alvarez stayed back, watching the tide pull in and out, carrying with it the fragments of a story that had taken decades to piece together. Somewhere in the endless stretch of ocean beyond, there were still secrets she'd never touch. But the case file for Daniel and Sophie Mercer now had an ending, and in her line of work, that was something close to peace.